Hi there, this is Dennis Velco with OutBüro, and thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of OutBüro Voices, where we have engaging and interesting conversations with LGBTQ professionals, entrepreneurs, and community leaders. And like so many times I say, I have such a privilege to talk with so many wonderful people who have been leaders in our community. And our guest today, Bob Witeck, is absolutely no different. He hits all the points of being both or all three, a professional, entrepreneur, and a community leader. Bob Witeck founded the first LGBT marketing and communications agency in the world. Welcome to the show, Bob.
Oh, Dennis, thank you so much. It's a privilege. I'm a huge fan of yours, and I'm grateful to be among so many peers and leaders around the world that are part of this community that you're building.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And it's very it's for me the reason I'm doing these shows is to one for knowledge, history, right? Also to give inspiration to others.
Mhm.
So many times, I hear from young people that they don't have a sense of a mentor or a sense of connecting and seeing opportunities. So I think it's really important to not just have the what's going on in Hollywood and what actor is caught in Tahiti coming out of it or wherever, coming out of the water in a white Speedo and look how big his junk is, which no offense to any other media platforms out there, but that's a lot of clickbait and not a lot of substance. And so getting these conversations is one, giving a platform for my guests, but also I feel providing a service to the LGBT community and really giving substance and value. So I appreciate your time and your willingness to be on the show. And so Bob, you're well known in some in circles of the LGBT community and of course in brands. But the average person probably wouldn't know who you are. And so what I'd love for you to do is take a few moments and take us back to the beginning and talk about kind of, what was the spark to create Wittek Communications and how did that all come to be?
Well, and let me tell you, it was an accident. The last person in my family who ran their own business was an entrepreneur, was my grandfather, who regrettably I never met. He died in the 1940s, but he was a shoemaker. He came over from Budapest in 1905 with $12 and opened up his business in Wisconsin. So he was the last in my genetic line, I think, to actually own a business. And I'm not fit to follow in his capable footsteps either. But when I was growing up, my passion was communications. I loved the media. And in fact, since I lived and grew up here in Washington, D.C., I was on Capitol Hill for the first 10 years of my career. So I ended up being a press secretary for a senator for 10 years, which was a great challenge and great opportunity. And I actually began to deal with some gay issues even long ago. But 10 years following that, I ended up at a very large PR firm called Hill+Knowlton. And Hill+Knowlton is everywhere, and they have a very large presence in Washington. So I became a senior vice president at Hill+Knowlton with a lot of corporate clients. But in 1993, there was such a cross section of issues in my life. I was an avid volunteer in the community. I'd become a volunteer for the Human Rights Campaign and been active in political issues and getting organized with the community in DC. But at that point, I just was frustrated that my day job and my passions weren't connected enough. I
Mm.
always thought that too, that corporations were natural allies of the LGBT community. I felt that we were missing the boat connecting business and the community's ideals because throughout time, I've always known that LGBTQ people are everywhere. We're all consumers, obviously, we live everywhere, but we're also in every company, we at every level. The glass ceilings and the closet have always been our enemy, and we've never had a chance to really evoke or voice the power that we had. And I always thought that companies should be educated so that they understood the opportunity, the business case. Basically, I think, Dennis, as you know it, the business case is so profound. And if they knew it and we came out of the closet, then what a difference that would make.
Yes, well, absolutely. And of course, study after study now in the last several years have shown that when companies do embrace diversity and inclusion in all of its spectrums, not just LGBT, but gender equality, racial equality, etc., that they outperform their competitors who don't and have the opportunity, depending on where they are on that path. But if they're, say, at zero, with no plans and no diversity and inclusion strategies to implementing those, and it might take a couple of years to really mature, but they have an opportunity to gain revenue by 30%. Now, obviously, that shouldn't be the motivational driver, but when you are doing, it's so good when you can say, we're doing the right thing, and that happens to translate into greater revenue. And there's lots of reasons, why people can bring their whole self to work. They can, ideate over all of their life experiences and how to creatively solve problems versus a homogeneous kind of, employee or consumer base that may have the same mindsets and so forth. So, of course, there's articles on OutBüro.com under employer resources. If you're listening to this and would like to delve into that, I don't want to take a whole lot, more of your time away from that. But, if you're listening or watching and you would like to know more about the impacts and the benefits of it, obviously jump over to OutBüro.com under employer resources and lots of articles there. So you were volunteering and you were working in communications and you felt a disjoint for it. So how did you make that coalesce and, spark?
Well, it's funny because, risk is something that all of us as entrepreneurs, we know. But I had
yes.
we have to be able to deal with we have to deal with that risk, accommodate that risk. Two things I chose to do. I got a business partner, a very close friend, Wes Combs, to join with me. So we were Witeck Combs when we began. This is almost 30 years ago, mind you. So this is a long, people, the business case you and I were just referring to, it seems to be well known today, but it wasn't 30 years ago. Companies were very skittish and very anxious. They thought of approaching LGBTQ consumer market was far, far more risk than reward. They just always felt that it was going to cause them to run off the road. But what happened at the time, not only just partnering with a business-minded friend who had shared my passions, but second, I had been working with American Airlines in prior life. And one of the senior executives at American called me up very quickly after our business opened because American had flown into a lot of turbulence in '93. There was a march on Washington, and one of the flight crew had asked for pillows and blankets on the flight to be removed because there were so many gay people on the flight for fear that there would be HIV and AIDS contamination. So that whole genesis of that drama became a worldwide boycott threat, actually, because the stupidity, obviously, of lack of professionalism and ignorance. If AIDS were transmitted in such a casual fashion, we know that everybody would have had HIV by now.
It would have been a pandemic like COVID, right?
Yes, it would have been, exactly. But the casual contamination in that sense was both offensive in every level and also connoting that gay people were all carriers. So this is pre-internet, as you can imagine. This is right. 93, 94. So I was called to come to Dallas and say, can you help? And yes. And when we had our very first meetings in Dallas with their executives, the question I wanted to know more than anything else is, are they real? Does American really want to solve this issue, or do they want to put lipstick on it? Do they want to just
Right.
make it go away? The thing that we learned to our delight was that they were a company of integrity, that they did get it. They understood the stupidity of the one employee. One person out of thousands can change the course of a company.
Yes, it
Um,
can.
it
Yes, it
does,
can.
and it has repeatedly in history. So the thing that happened at that time, that they got involved in class action suits on this as well, and we began to work with them directly on policies and practices, not just messaging. And
Uh,
so what we wanted to do was turn around who they were as a company and deal with it to transform them into a leader. And they were willing to go there. In fact, they took a lot of risks in those early years. They had tremendous amount of boycott and backlash threat from anti-gay groups. On one day, Dennis, on one day about 3 years into this, every major anti-gay group, a conservative group, put out a full-page ad in the New York Times and probably 10 other newspapers in the country attacking Americans. And
hmm.
that company did not change course. Can you imagine that happening today? It wouldn't happen today because we've obviously because of progress, but at that time, companies had to stand up.
Well, it actually does still happen today to some extent. I just read the other
They wouldn't
day.
put it in. They wouldn't put it in print ads. That's for sure.
Right, right. Well, that's also very expensive, a lot cheaper on the
Yes.
internet. But yeah, right now,
Uh,
because of Kellogg, there's a right-wing group calling for all right-wing, folks to boycott Kellogg's and a
yeah.
couple other companies because of, being showing their inclusivity. So which that just reminds me again, that was like, as you stated, 28 to 30 years ago. And
Right.
it's just so sad that we have similar examples of that still today.
Yes.
So that just shows how much one work has been done, but just how much more work still remains. We cannot
We do.
become complacent.
You're right. It's funny. I wish. Hold on a second. I want to show you something. If I can show you
Sure.
this. This is it happened. I just found this last week, but this just appeared
Right.
um, at that same time because the Disney boycott, which people today probably are not as aware, but this is what these groups were about. They were major campaigns
Hmm.
to take on companies, but Disney and American Airlines and a few others were the poster child at that time. But if they had bent or surrendered, I think it would have changed the direction of our market because if they could have yielded a surrender then, I think a lot of other companies wouldn't have been as brave.
You're absolutely right. It takes those companies with a foundation of integrity and understanding to stand up and not fold under the voices of ignorance and learned hatred.
Exactly right. And that was the message throughout the all the years, the earliest years when we were talking to companies like American Airlines, Ford Motor Company, IBM. We were working with quite a few companies. And along the way, they all wanted to know the business case. They want to know the upsides. But they also asked questions about dealing with backlash. They expected it. And
Mm.
it showed you that their values were driving the course. Their values were driven by a business message. They weren't there to change the world, but they were there to connect with the world and to find business opportunities wherever they are.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting. One of my buddies, Fabrice Holdart, who wrote the LGBTQ diversity inclusion business case for the United Nations, who's now at
Right.
Outleaders. In our conversation, he said that, LGBTQ inclusivity is kind of like the canary in the coal mine, because
Yes.
if you're doing that well, you're also doing diversity and inclusion across, again, all the spectrum of race, ethnicity, and so forth, well. And if
That's
you're
right.
not doing LGBT inclusivity well, you're probably not doing the others to its fullest either. So, so very interesting. So, and I was just thinking while you're also talking is that, 30 years ago, there wasn't many, if any, directors of diversity inclusion at these companies. There weren't even many diversity and inclusion consultants and practices that these companies could go to for just that. And that's what I find interesting is, you started a branding and a communications company, but you also had to do dual purpose and
Right.
be a diversity and inclusion consultant. That's very fascinating.
That is absolutely true. It's funny. I want to mention in that very first meeting we had, the one of their top lawyers was in the room. He said to me at one point, said, "Do you think we have many gay people at American Airlines?"
Oh, oh, I'm sorry if I just blew the mic out. I'm going to have to take that sound out. That is
Dennis,
freaking
I
hilarious. Are you kidding
I
me?
had to resist that impulse to do what you just did because I wanted to say, have you ever flown? I didn't know whether or not
Exactly.
he had experience with a lot of their workforce. But the funny thing was, I realized the question was so important to me to hear because one, I thought if he doesn't really have a grip on it, then we have an issue. It turned out one of the colleagues in the room who became a very close friend of me over time was gay, but he wasn't out in that meeting. And so I said, well, there's the issue, we're facing is that they're surrounded, the colleagues are gay, but they don't know it. So that became an opportunity for their own people to get a voice. But Dennis, in that very first meeting, our first advice was for them to form an LGBTQ workforce resource group. In
Awesome.
fact, I still have the memo where we laid out how to form the resource groups and also to allow other groups to form, people of color, obviously women. We figured the single most important thing they should do is have the ear and the advice of their own gay workforce. And that has served them extremely well. That's been around now for over 25, well, almost 30 years. And it's changed the dialogue internally so that they're really integrated into policies and practices.
Well, very interesting. And so they didn't have any employee resource groups prior to
No,
that. None.
no.
Okay. And so you advise them to start an LGBT ERG.
But we said with others. So we said
Yes. Yeah. I would
you need a council, but the LGBT group was the first to form.
really.
And yes, it was the very first one. And then the others quickly followed people of color, women, people with disabilities. It was great because they gave a common platform and focused on inclusion.
Well, okay. So one, you were the first marketing and communications company. You had because there weren't diversity inclusion consultants and directors back then, you kind of had to fill that role. They didn't have ERGs at all. And
That's
you
right.
introduced that concept. Now, let me ask you, when you started to go to subsequent employers and brands,
Mm.
did they also not have ERGs? Did you start that entire concept?
I wish I had, but no. To
Okay.
me, I was familiar with them beginning. And in fact, in some areas, for example, IBM has always been a pioneer, always. They really have got it over many years. So I think theirs were in place before then. And there were a few others, but they were not common. And
Mm.
they were not organized in any real way. It's funny though. About that time, the mid '90s, I attended a meeting in San Francisco called for AGOG, AGOG. It was for a group of groups, and it was the first time that some of these ERGs had gathered in one place. So Disney was the convener, and this group turned into Out
Mm.
and Equal Workplace Associates. But at that time, I remember going to the meeting, and at the end, we all had to, fold up our folding chairs. I mean, that's how unsophisticated it was. But
Mm.
there was like Hewlett Packard, there was American Airlines, there was Disney, but the room wasn't packed. It was like 30 people.
Wow.
Today, when Out Equal has a convening, they'll have 7,000 in their room.
Very
So,
interesting. Very
yeah.
interesting. And for those listening too, I'm going to put a card right up here to my interview with Stan Kimmer. He was one of the founding people at IBM. He was the first
Yes.
out executive at IBM. And so I'll put a link to that you can right click, open it up in another window, or if you're on YouTube or on our website. And if you're not, come to our website and look up Stan Kimmer, Kimer. Absolutely fantastic human being, and a great story on his journey at IBM of 32 years. So I appreciate you bringing IBM up. They have always been quite the leader.
And I know Stan and I know Fabrice. These are people who are big change agents. I'm delighted that you're there in your orbit, Dennis.
Yes. Well, I'm trying. And so talk about maybe a little bit, kind of about your communication side. So what were the kind of things, outside of which you've already have indicated, you had to kind of be a diversity inclusion consultant in it, help form ERGs in a few locations and so forth, but let's talk about your kind of communications and marketing side, because
Sure.
that's the sexy and the sizzle.
Is that what you think? You don't want to see how sausage is made.
Yeah, I hear you.
But actually, when we started, opened our doors, we had two major clients. The first was American Airlines, as I mentioned. The other was actually the Human Rights Campaign Foundation, because they had just acquired the intellectual property of something, a tiny, obscure little program called National Coming Out Day. National Coming Out Day at that time was really the cottage industry. Rob Eichberg and a couple others who had founded it had a Keith Haring artwork that showed somebody coming out of the closet. And that was basically their asset, was that. But nobody had marketed it. Now, remember, this is 1993. So National Coming Out Day was not national in any meaningful sense. Coming out was something people did, but it wasn't a cause. And so we were charged with marketing and launching it in a serious way. It was pre-internet, mind you. But what we ended up doing is working with celebrity spokespersons a lot. So the first two were Dan Butler. Dan Butler played Bulldog on Frasier. He was an openly gay actor. And the other one's Amanda Bearse, the openly lesbian actor on Married with Children, which I think only like 5 people I know have seen, because I didn't care for that program. But she played a heterosexual, of course, and so did Dan Butler, played a rabidly heterosexual, player. And we came up with a line, we came up with a message. It said, "I'm not a straight person, but I play one on TV."
Okay.
And of course, a takeoff on the advertising. And those two would do video spots for us. They would do appearances, and we took them, wherever we could bring them, they could make a difference, and people loved it. But you have to build on that. So we had others. We had Candace Gingrich, Newt Gingrich's half sister. We had Greg McGanus. We had I'm trying to think of all the Chaz Bono, but Chaz at that time was chastity, speaking to audiences, and Chaz was great running around. And in fact, on National Coming Out Day, which is every year on October 11th, for the first time, Cher showed up to speak to a gay audience. And it was held, the Names Project had the quilt on the mall that year. So on October 11th, the mall was filled with the AIDS quilts. And on the ellipse, right near the White House, we had Cher showed up and spoke to this audience. And it was electric, just electric, to have her speak. But she had never done that before. But Chaz had convinced her, of course, to speak on her behalf.
Yeah, outside of her concerts.
Right. Well, yes, exactly.
It
Exactly.
was just a specific known LGBT, but honey, her
Right.
concerts, probably half the
I
audience are gay
know.
men, right?
Yeah. Oh, you're so true. But it's interesting. Chaz brought his stepmother too, Mary Bono. She was a Republican member of Congress. She was there. Cher was there. I just thought it was crazy, but it was a lovely moment. But that's the kind of thing we did: events, posters. You couldn't do anything digital because it didn't exist at the
Right.
time, but we could do all these other things. And I think National Coming Out Day then became a thing.
Oh,
You
well, it
know,
definitely has. Gosh,
yeah, right,
it filled my inbox,
right,
on the October. Now, if I may ask, it just kind of,
sure,
hit my consciousness is
yes,
why October 11th? Was there anything specific around choosing that date?
yes. It happened to be the date of the March on Washington in 1987.
Mm,
And so out of that March, they came up with what more will we do going forward? Suggestions, things that grew out of it. There were some organizations were launched that year that grew out of the march. For example, I'm not sure it did it that year, but I think the Service Members Legal Defense Network grew out of one of the marches, maybe the '93 march.
mm.
But different life was given to different ideas. And National Coming Out Day was one because for exactly the same thing that we've said all along, you can't change people unless you're open.
Abs
You can't affect political change. You can't affect business. You can't affect anything unless you're honest.
Absolutely. And that brings me to one point is that still today, only about 48% of LGBTQ plus people are out at work.
Yes,
And
that's right.
it's because they don't feel safe. They believe that they're going to be discriminated against. And
Yes,
I love to write about studies. It's one of my favorite things because then, if I write about a study by a very prestigious organization, no one can
right,
refute what I'm saying because I didn't say it. I'm only interpreting it and regurgitating it, right? And study after study now shows, several studies now for the last couple of years shows that when people are applying for their job, if there's anything on their resume that indicates LGBT, like for example, you might have been the IT service, help desk person at the New York LGBT Community Center for 5 years. But if that's
right,
on your resume as LGBT Community Center, you only have about a 50% chance of even getting a call. And then
right,
also, people are discriminated against. Gay men are discriminated against. And although, of course, I don't agree with gender inequality on pay, but gay men are often, if hired, are paid at a similar discounted rate because of the stereotypes and the conscious and
mhm,
unconscious bias. So again,
right,
folks, this work, although folks like Bob has been working on this and many other wonderful people who I hope to get on the show for the last 30, 40 years have been working on this, we have so much more work to do. And we have to partner with organizations that represent people of color,
right,
organizations that represent women, and so
right,
forth. I interviewed Naomi, who was one of the founders of Fairy God Boss, which is a site similar to OutBüro, but for women. And they include transgender in it and so forth. And we had that conversation. So I'm going to plug yet another show, just because it really ties in, and we've had a conversation or two in the past, but I really enjoy that's why I love doing these shows, is because it gives us an opportunity to really get into the depth
yeah,
and the span. And I'm so fascinated about how you started out and the depth and breadth that you had to do because it didn't exist. So very,
right,
very fascinating. So not get all deep on you folks, okay? but it's why I do what I do. It's because there is such still a challenge to go. So let's kind of lighten it up a bit if we could. And get back to kind of that, maybe talk about some of the projects and more other projects that you worked on for companies. Are there's, of course, the coming out day. If you
Yeah,
don't know of that, you've probably have lived in a cave for the last 20 years. So you've done a really great job on getting that, off the ground and becoming part of the consciousness of the community and broader community at large. But maybe share, so folks can kind of get a sense of
sure,
what you've touched in the past, maybe,
sure.
what we might recognize that
Oh,
you
sure.
help bring to the light.
It's funny. The work that we did, notably, we helped launch Logo at the time when Logo was put on the air. I worked
Oh,
with MTV Networks for 2 years leading up to the development of it. And then when the evening when it was launched, I actually traveled with the MTV Network sales teams because once they created content, right, once they had the ready the programming, they still had to air it, and the only way to air it is through third parties. You have to do it on Comcast or DirecTV or
oh,
RCA, or you have to sell it to your distribution networks. So my task many times was to explain the business case, the market, and the opportunity, and help show examples of programming because obviously they wanted to know that it wasn't adult,
hmm,
that it was family friendly, and they also wanted to be able to work with their customer service representatives to explain to people why they're offering it because it was pretty historic, right, at the time to do that. In
yeah.
fact, before they aired it, they were thinking of it as a paid cable channel, but the focus groups came back of gay people who were responding. They said, no, we want to see commercials. What we want to know is our channel looks like other channels, and we also want to know what advertisers want to reach us.
Hmm.
So they really wanted an advertising revenue supported, cable channel. So we ran around, talked to the Comcast and all the others about the offering, what it was going to be. And by the time it aired, the night it aired, there were 18 million, I think, cable households were on board, which in the cable land is a lot, especially beginning. They were a threshold. They wanted to reach 10 million on day one, but now it's significantly higher. But 18 million was and interestingly, MTV Networks asked me to go on ABC News that night because they were doing a story about it. So they
Hmm.
wanted me to be the voice. So I spoke to the business opportunity. But ABC News, I thought I don't know, I thought they sort of mishandled the story because I always say this: news is about two things: change or conflict. And I thought it was a great change story because it was progress. It was progress. They wanted to bring in some adversaries who were saying it was going to be terrible that gay people are going to be on TV. And the funny thing is, a line that I didn't get in my on the air, I said, I find it interesting. I'm on ABC where when you aired Soap, they put on their very first bisexual character on TV, Billy Crystal, and they have thousands and thousands and thousands of postcards, but it never stopped ABC from airing Soap, the comedy Soap. So I thought, that just shows you that people can react, but if they like it, they're going to watch it. And that's the same with Logo. If it's good, they'll watch it. And an obscure drag queen came out of this, as you know, somebody named RuPaul grew out of that launch. And RuPaul is sort of like the Simpsons on the Tracy Ullman show. They were like a little tiny bit on Tracy Ullman, and now, of course, they're a 30, 40-year, phenomenon. And same with RuPaul. RuPaul's worldwide global domination continues, but it
Yeah.
began on Logo at that moment. So it's kind of exciting that they gave birth to these ideas.
Very interesting. And even just that story, to me, just illustrates, kind of tying back to also the American Airlines. You weren't just, oh, creating an ad to be in print magazines, right? You really
Yes,
went in a full-fledged
yes,
consultative manner
yes,
and
yes,
partnered with them on so many levels that, whenever you hear of a a marketing agency, you really just
Right.
think of banner ads and print ads and maybe a couple article
Right.
copies. The average person just doesn't think of, if you were to think of a media company, an advertising company, think of them as going as deep and broad that you have done. So I find that extremely inspirational and enlightening.
Well,
So,
Dennis, it's interesting. Even at the time, again, we had to make people comfortable to accept airing this programming. And
yeah.
actually, I wrote and recorded customer service tapes for
Oh,
these distributors, and now they're now at the Smithsonian's archives
really?
because the Smithsonian wanted to have this as a record of how a historic moment like that in terms of LGBTQ representation became a reality. And
Hmm.
so it was answering the questions that homeowners might have about, or cable customers might have, and trying to respond to them in a very, what I would say is a conversational way that wasn't, was designed to make it, you know uh, uh, not acceptable so much as the idea that diverse programming is a good thing, and
Yeah.
that all, even if your household isn't excited about it, many are, you know.
Right. And of course, if you don't like what's on the channel, simply
Exactly.
don't tune in. It's
You
that
can go to
simple.
you go to cooking, you go to golf, you go to fashion, you can go wherever you want. So having channels for diverse tastes is American as apple pie.
Just like you can go watch 700 Club, as my
Exactly.
grandmother used to do, right?
Exactly.
Doesn't mean I'm going to
Exactly.
watch it.
Nope.
It's all a
Doesn't.
personal choice. But
It is.
don't limit others just because you don't like something that you're never going to watch.
Exactly.
Biatch. So very cool. Very cool. Wow, very enlightening. Okay. And so what if, I even to ask the question, what has been some of the most challenging things? It just is like, OMG, you've already just kind of said a lot.
That was heavy lifting throughout.
Yeah.
But we also had two projects might interest you. They weren't actually gay, but one of them was a notable, famous bookstore in D.C. called Kramer Books, and a lawyer named Ken Starr subpoenaed Kramer Books because Monica Lewinsky had purchased some books that she gave to President Clinton. So they went to the bookstore and tried to get her book purchases on the record. And the American Booksellers, the Library Association, the ACLU, and everybody else did not want to have investigative attorneys invade the privacy of someone's right to read whatever it is they want to read.
Hmm.
So we had massive press conferences at the bookstore to defend them against turning over Monica Lewinsky's book buying habits. It was fascinating because it was a tiny little part of that huge story, but it was one people related to, and they wanted to defend a bookseller. You know, so that was kind of fun. That lasted for several months till Ken Starr caved. And then another thing, we did a work with an actor you've heard of, Christopher Reeve, who
Mm-hmm.
was an environmental activist at the time, and he was doing an environmental program. We were working with him, and about 3 months later, he had his famous, terrible, tragic accident. And then we represented Christopher Reeve for the next 10 years of his life as he became a activist and champion for spinal cord injury recovery.
Wow.
And that was sort of an accident. I mean, in every sense, his life changed, but also the opportunity to help him be a global spokesperson
Hmm.
for the science of spinal cord repair. So it was really breathtaking to help do that. He had no lack of getting press, right? But we wanted to make sure that he got the right press and that we were changing hearts and minds about the science.
Hmm. Very, very interesting. Just
It was.
how did he come into your sphere? I mean, did he just become aware of you, or was it just like a random phone call?
So we had mutual friends who worked for this environmental organization. So
Okay.
because of his environmental advocacy, we overlapped. But it was
Ah.
from that overlapping working with him at that moment that, see, he had always had Hollywood publicists, which are very different, right? They're the
Hmm.
ones who have to worry about how many times his name and likeness appears in People and a variety of other places. We had to be able to put him into science advocacy media, the New York Times, a
Hmm.
lot of different kinds of media. So he needed something different from what he had. And
Got
yet,
you.
at the same time, he was still trying to do some work in entertainment. He actually made a movie during his when he made a remake of what's the famous Jimmy Stewart movie, Rear Window.
Hmm.
He made a television version of Rear Window for that because he was in a wheelchair. And so all throughout this whole process, we had so many occasions to do some amazing things with him that were really great. One was he went to Israel in his wheelchair to go to the Wailing Wall, and we were curious why the Israelis had invited him to come, at this moment. And it turns out they were trying to get over. They had just had a series, a couple of years of tourism disasters because of violence in the region. And so they wanted to sort of connect people with the idea that it was safe again to travel. And who better than somebody in a wheelchair coming to the Wailing Wall? So they made a big deal out of his being there, which was good. And of course, he educated a lot of people about, his life, which is great.
Hmm.
So we've
Very
had
cool.
some fun adventures along the way that are a little different, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very, very neat. And so, what kind of stuff are you doing today?
Well, it's interesting. I was just beginning work with a new client when the pandemic hit. I had just started working with Cunard, and Cunard, of course, is most famous for its massive ships, the Queen Elizabeth II, the Queen Mary II, the Queen Victoria, and they wanted to, they've been around almost 100 years, but they wanted to be relevant to this contemporary generations. And one of the ways you do it is by doing a fuller, more inclusive story about LGBTQ travel. You and I know one thing. We disproportionately love to travel. Gay people have wanderlust. After 9/11, after the last recession, and even now, all the data says that we're ready to hit the road, in many ways. We just have that need to reconnect. And Cunard, I think wisely, when they approached me, actually, they just said, we want to find a way that, LGBTQ people, we've always had room for them everywhere. They've been on our ships and they're on our staff, they're everywhere, but we're not telling the story. So they wanted to tell the story. But then, of course, the ships were in dry dock the last year and a half. They haven't come out yet. They're just about to. So that would have been a great journey. In fact, my husband and I went on the Queen Mary to Britain about 4 months ahead of the COVID lockdown, and that was a great experience because Meryl Streep had been on the same trip a month earlier and made a movie out of it. She and Diane Beast made a HBO movie on the same voyage, which I thought was wonderful.
Huh. Very cool. And kudos to you because what better way to get to know your customer than your customer than to
Exactly.
experience their product?
That you have to in every sense, and they were very generous to allow it. I did write an article for them in one of their large magazines, and we showed them the whole thing about my husband and I were celebrating our 25 years together, our
Hmm.
anniversary. So it was sort of an anniversary trip, which was lovely. People love occasions, and crossings are occasions, right?
Yeah.
You have 7 days. You have to determine whether or not you love each other, but now you have to find out if you like each other.
Yeah, stuck in and I have never done a cruise.
Oh
Uh,
my! And you
uh,
call yourself a gay man?
oh, I've cruised, but I haven't done a cruise.
Okay, those are different.
But it is something I have on my radar. And interestingly, one of my next call, not a interview, but a call, is with a travel agency who does cruises.
Oh, wow. Wow.
He's actually, we're dialoguing, he's picking my brain, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, and I've already told him about you. Don't know if he can afford you or not, but
My husband and I have done a number of cruises, and I have to say they're breathtakingly fun, especially river cruises, for example, because
oh,
the groups are smaller.
mm-hmm.
You have a chance to get to meet quite a few people, and you know every night your hotel is right there. You don't ever have to pack or unpack. And then when you land, you just get off and you're right in the middle of the city.
Oh, well, I could definitely see that. I could definitely see that going back to Europe. As I mentioned prior
Yeah.
to us airing, I had lived in Germany for almost 6 years. And I
Oh
know
yeah.
on the Rhine River that goes through that they have cruises.
We did the
Yeah.
Rhine and the Danube. They're really brilliant.
Okay. Well,
Very nice.
yeah, I will put that on my radar. My whole thing is just like, OMG. I mean, I just being trapped. I like to be able to go and move. So a small boat with lots of stops or a much larger boat, I'd be okay with it. But
But you're
yeah,
right about being confined. You need freedom. Yeah.
yeah, I guess one of my friends in the past have kind of called me squirrely because it's like for example, whenever I go out, if I go out with even a small group of people, if I want to go, I'm going. I will. If you all want to stay here, fine. And sometimes it's just me going home. But I'll dump. I will leave. I will not stay. And yeah, but yeah, I'm looking forward to getting back to Germany because I have several friends there. One of my good friends, she's transgender, and I've known her since I was 18 years old.
Oh wow.
Yeah. And and there's a couple other people that I've known almost as long, back in Germany. So maybe I'll look at some, if there's a gay Rhine cruise,
Oh
coupling
yeah.
coupling that with meeting up with longtime friends and so forth, so I can get a lot of bang for my travel buck.
I'm with you there.
Very cool. Well, we're coming up here on our time scheduled, and I'm sure you're a
Yeah.
busy person. So, is there maybe anything, for our last few minutes that we haven't talked about that you would like to share?
Well, the one thing I would say, there's one thing, Dennis, you can appreciate if you've been around the block a little bit, as I have. And I think both of us have experience in the world. I find that in the business that I'm in, I'm learning every day, and
Mm,
I think that that's the thing I treasure a lot is that every day it's a new world. First of all, it's changed from risk and reward to mostly reward, but also new discovery. I think what we're figuring out about gender identity, or the plight of transgender people, for example, and also the obscurity and the erasure of bisexual people, which is a problem. I
mm,
think there's issues here in our community that we've got to grapple with and also educate business about. Business has to know that it's not right when transgender people are not just diminished but erased and discriminated against so ugly in so many ugly ways. Right now, they're facing, as you know, with friends that you have, is that it's fear and terror for some of them, and
mm.
for younger ones, particularly for younger ones, you really don't have the arc of history that over time we're going to be able to prevail. I think we'll absolutely prevail, but it's kind of scary right now. I think we have to give them hope.
I completely agree. And for our listening audience, if you don't happen to know anyone who's transgender, I've interviewed already numerous, probably 10 people. My very first interview was with a two-spirit transgender person, going back now, and I've released, as of right now, not including my backlog of editing, but I released over like 83 to 85 episodes. And of that, probably 10 or 11 are of transgender people. And,
Yeah.
one or two from Germany, several here throughout the United States, some with
Yeah.
military background. And so, if you don't, listen to their stories and all the different things that they do. One really great person, Xander Keig, Keig, if you search on the website, was prior military, is a health and wellness person, actually works with transgender military persons, although he
Mm.
is now a veteran. And there's just a rich array of people to get to know. And I can appreciate, you and I are very similar in the sense that every single day I learn something. And being an entrepreneur, seriously, if you're not learning something new every day, and then trying to become better, you're going to become stagnant. So every
Yeah.
single day, whether that's I learned something about marketing and drip email marketing, or something about my technology on my website. And then two, I also kind of, because I work 10 to 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, um, I also break up my day and now spend 5 or 20 minutes watching how to cook enchiladas in a new way, or how to cook in a great Indian dish. Or I'm also watching right now some real estate investing people. But I constantly need that. If I'm not
Yeah.
learning something and growing and expanding, I feel like there's a huge void in my life. So I can
I
totally
know.
appreciate that and our camaraderie on that particular
Yeah.
facet. Well, wonderful. Gosh, this has been such an enlightening conversation, even for me. There's so many things that 90% of what you talked about your company and what you've done, I did not know. So I so much appreciate the opportunity to get to
Pleasure.
know you better, and for
Excellent.
our audience to get to know you better. Bob, thank you so much.
Dennis, my pleasure, my honor. I support and salute you and send you love.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for staying tuned to this episode of OutBüro Voices. You've been listening to Bob Witeck of Witeck Communications. Be sure to check out his website if you happen to need some marketing communication needs. You've just heard the depth and breadth that he goes to bat for you. While you're on here, be sure to, on whatever application or website that you're listening or viewing this on, be sure to hit that like or subscribe or follow button. And if you're on YouTube, hit that notification bell to be sure that you get notified as new episodes come out. We have a backlog right now of some wonderful episodes, so make sure you get notified and stay tuned. Thank you so much. This is Dennis Velco with OutBüro.com, your LGBTQ professional and entrepreneurial networking and job board site. Bye-bye.